the lights dim, and the crowd goes quiet. Somewhere in the haze of cigarette smoke and brass horns, a man steps to the microphone with a smile that could turn pain into rhythm. His name isn't the one most remember when they speak of soul, but his sound, warm, raw, and deeply human, carried the heartbeat of an entire generation. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth. And for a moment in time, he found it before history let his name fade into silence. This is the story of Joe Tex, the man who gave soul its laughter, its rhythm, and its will to endure. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. He was born Joseph Arrington Jr. on the 8th of August 1935 in Rogers, Texas, a place where summers were long, music spilled from the church doors, and dreams had to fight their way through dust and poverty. His father, Joseph Sr., and mother, Sherry Sue, separated when he was still a boy. After the divorce, his mother moved to Baytown, taking Joe and his sister to live with their grandmother. It was there, in the small corners of Texas life, that Joe first learned how sound could lift a person out of struggle. He sang in the church choir, played baritone sax in the school band, and danced in the streets for loose change. People remembered the kid with the wide grin, the one who could make the hardest days feel lighter. By his teenage years, Joe had already started to chase something bigger. He took jobs shining shoes and delivering papers to help his family, but his heart stayed with music. When he performed at George Washington Carver High, his voice filled the gym like sunlight through a stained glass window. In those years, Houston was growing into a rhythm city. Small clubs and corner bars held talent contests every week, giving young dreamers a chance to be heard. Joe entered one of those contests, a small event that would change everything. He performed a song called "It's in the Book," standing alongside other local hopefuls, including a young Johnny Nash. Joe didn't just win. He stole the night. The prize was $300 and a week-long stay at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, the beating heart of black music at the time. For a boy from Baytown, it was like being handed a key to another world. At 19, Joe stepped onto the stage of the Apollo Theater during amateur night. The lights were hot, the crowd restless, but the moment he opened his mouth, the room quieted. He won again, not once, but week after week. That was where fate found him. Henry Glover of King Records saw the spark and offered Joe his first contract. His mother wanted him to finish school first, and he did. After graduation in 1955, Joe packed his things and headed to New York City. He was 19, broke, and determined. New York was hard on newcomers. Joe worked odd jobs, even cooking in a Jewish cemetery to pay rent. But the stage never stopped calling. He changed his name to something simpler, sharper, Joe Tex. The name carried a sense of pride, a reminder of where he came from and what he was fighting for. Between 1955 and 1957, he recorded with King Records. The songs were promising, but none took off. Titles like My Biggest Mistake and She's Mine showed his early style, a mix of storytelling and humor, yet radio ignored them. It was a humbling time. He had talent, but talent alone wasn't enough in the crowded rhythm and blues scene. Still, there was something undeniable about Joe Tex. When he stepped on stage, he didn't just sing, he preached. He talked to his audience, made them laugh, made them feel seen. That style would later define him, a man who turned every performance into a conversation. For now, though, he was just another voice trying to be heard in a city full of noise. But deep down, he carried something most didn't: patience. He believed that every note, every failed record, was just another step toward the sound that would finally make the world stop and listen. And as one chapter closed, another quietly began. The boy from Baytown was ready to turn struggle into soul. When Joe Tex first arrived in New York in 1955, he was just another hungry voice in a city that didn't slow down for anyone. The rhythm and blues world was crowded, and record executives wanted hits, not hope. He signed with King Records and started recording his first singles songs like My Biggest Mistake, Got What It Takes, and She's Mine. Each one carried charm and rhythm, but they didn't catch on. For every record pressed, there were 100 others just like it waiting to be forgotten. Joe's early days were a lesson in humility. He poured everything into those sessions, long hours in smoky studios, chasing the perfect take while living off coffee and faith. But the world wasn't listening yet. Then came the story that defined his early frustration. Joe claimed he had written the song Fever, needing quick money, and sold the rights to a King Records executive. The song went to Little Willie John, who turned it into a national hit. Joe's name appeared nowhere. For a young artist trying to make rent, it was a heartbreak he carried quietly. Still, he refused to give up. In 1958, Joe left King and joined Ace Records, hoping for a fresh start. He recorded songs full of humor and grit, Cut It Out Baby, You're Going Out of My Mind, and Open the Door. None of them charted, but each one shaped his growing identity as a performer who mixed talk, truth, and laughter like no one else. What Joe lacked in radio play, he made up for on stage. When he opened shows for Jackie Wilson, Little Richard, or a young James Brown, audiences took notice. Joe didn't just sing, he performed. He'd talk between verses, tell stories, tease the crowd, then leap into dance steps that no one had ever seen before. The microphone became part of his act, tossed, spun, and caught mid-air in perfect rhythm. That stagecraft became his signature. He could turn a nightclub into a church and a sermon into a show. People came to see the voice, but they stayed for the man behind it. By 1960, Joe was recording for Anna Records, the same label connected to Motown founders Barry and Gwen Gordy. There, he tried something new, a cover of Etta James's All I Could Do Was Cry. His voice carried both power and pain, a sound that could cut through the noise. It wasn't a hit, but it proved one thing. Joe Tex wasn't meant to imitate anyone. He was carving his own space. That same year, he recorded a song he'd been shaping for months. Baby, You're Right. It was a soulful, playful track about pride and reconciliation. But before it could make its way up the charts, James Brown recorded his own version, rewrote the lyrics, and listed himself as co-writer beside Joe's name. Brown's version soared to number 2 on the R&B charts. For Joe Tex, it was déjà vu, another song, another loss, another reminder that the industry wasn't fair. Yet this time, he didn't stay silent. He responded with humor, with swagger, with resilience. The rivalry between Joe Tex and James Brown had begun. Brown may have had the crown, but Joe had the courage to challenge it. He mocked Brown's stage cape routine during live shows, rolling on the floor shouting, "Please, somebody help me out of this cape." Crowds roared. What started as imitation turned into open defiance. Behind the laughter, though, was pain, the pain of being the man who inspired, yet went uncredited, the performer others borrowed from, but rarely acknowledged. Still, Joe Tex stood tall. Each slight became fuel. Each borrowed move, a reminder that his style was worth stealing. He didn't need to say it out loud every time he stepped on stage. The truth spoke for him. And as the 60s began, Joe Tex wasn't chasing anyone anymore. He was building his own kingdom, one show, one crowd, one song at a time. By the early 1960s, Joe Tex had become a seasoned fighter in the ring of rhythm and blues. He had learned how to lose gracefully, how to smile through disappointment, and how to keep faith when the audience stopped clapping. Every night on stage, he left a piece of himself behind sweat, soul, and that unshakable Texas charm. In 1964, Joe's fortunes began to shift. Bobby Keelan, founder of Dial Records, saw in him what others had missed, not just a singer, but a storyteller. Keelan signed him as his main artist and struck a distribution deal with Atlantic Records. For the first time, Joe had both creative freedom and a partner who believed in his voice. They recorded dozens of songs, but most barely moved the needle. Joe was used to that by now. He had already recorded more than 30 tracks that went nowhere, but he refused to let failure define him. His day would come. He just didn't know it was hiding in a song he almost didn't want released. Late in 1964, Joe recorded Hold What You Got. It was a tender message about love and gratitude, delivered in his trademark half-sung, half-spoken style. When Keelan decided to release it, Joe protested. He thought it was too simple, too quiet to stand out. But Keelan trusted his instincts, and he was right. Hold What You Got exploded across the airwaves. By the time Joe heard the news, the single had already sold 200,000 copies. It climbed the R&B charts and broke into the Billboard Hot 100, his first real hit after nearly a decade of struggle. For the first time, Joe Tex wasn't just an opening act or a local name. He was a star. With that success came a flood of follow-ups. You Got What It Takes, A Woman Can Change a Man, and One Monkey Don't Stop No Show. Each song carried a blend of humor and wisdom that became uniquely his. He spoke directly to listeners, teasing, advising, confessing like a preacher who knew how to make people laugh while telling them the truth. His voice wasn't smooth like Sam Cooke's or fiery like James Brown's. It was conversational, human, perfectly flawed. He didn't just sing to people, he sang with them. In an era when soul was becoming polished and urban, Joe Tex kept it southern, honest, and real. By 1965, he was finally standing where he had always dreamed to be, at the crossroads of rhythm and truth. But even as applause followed him from city to city, a shadow lingered. Fame had a way of lifting some and overlooking others, and Joe Tex, despite all he had given, still felt the world watching someone else wear the crown that should have been his. He didn't complain. He just smiled, adjusted the microphone, and told another story. Because for Joe Tex, the music had never been about revenge or rivalry. It had always been about reaching people one heart, one soul, one song at a time. By the middle of 1965, Joe Tex was no longer the underdog from Baytown. His name filled marquees across the South, his voice poured out of car radios, and his laughter echoed through dance halls from Atlanta to Chicago. For years, he had fought to be heard now. Finally, the world was listening. Hold What You Got had opened the door, but it was the songs that followed that turned him into a force of nature. A Sweet Woman Like You, The Love You Save, and I Want to Do Everything for You. Each carried that unmistakable Joe Tex touch, equal parts, humor, honesty, and hope. He didn't just sing about love, he dissected it, counseled it, forgave it. His lyrics spoke like a friend sitting across the table, telling you the truth you needed to hear. Audiences adored him. On stage, Joe was electricity, barefoot sometimes, always animated, his microphone moving like an extension of his soul. He'd talk to the crowd, tease the men, charm the women, and make everyone laugh before hitting them with a line that cut straight to the heart. When he performed, skinny legs and all, the laughter roared like thunder. But hidden beneath the jokes was his genius, using humor to expose pride, weakness, and humanity. By 1966, Joe Tex had 6 top 40 R&B singles and a reputation for being one of the most dynamic live performers in America. Critics began calling him the philosopher of soul, a man who could preach and dance in the same breath. He was defining a new kind of Southern sound, less polished than Motown, more spiritual than funk, something rooted in the soil of the South, in church pews and juke joints alike. And yet, even at his peak, Joe Tex never forgot who he was. When he converted to Islam that same year, taking the name Yusuf Haziez, it wasn't for show. It was a personal turning point, a search for discipline, peace, and purpose beyond applause. He began mixing messages of faith and morality into his songs, urging fans to find strength in love and forgiveness rather than bitterness. Still, the charts kept calling. Show Me, Papa Was Too, and I Believe I'm Gonna Make It stormed the airwaves, proving that his spiritual journey hadn't dimmed his musical fire. His voice grew deeper, more reflective, filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes after years of standing in the fire and walking out stronger. By 1967, Joe Tex had something rare: respect from musicians, affection from fans, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had earned it all. There were no shortcuts, no industry tricks, no borrowed fame, just grit, talent, and the rhythm of a man who had finally made peace with his place in the world. Under the stage lights, he'd smile and say softly before every show, "Let's make them feel something." And he always did. Fame has a strange rhythm. It can lift a man so high that the air becomes thin, then quietly take his breath away. For Joe Tex, the late 1960 were full of that uneasy balance between triumph and tension. His records were selling. His shows were packed, but behind the music, an old shadow was stirring again: the rivalry with James Brown, the man who had once taken his songs, his moves, and even his love. Their feud had cooled in public, But among fans and promoters, comparisons never stopped. When Joe's Skinny Legs and All began climbing the charts, Brown reportedly pressured radio DJs not to play it too often. The song still became a hit, but it never reached the #1 spot Joe had dreamed of. It hurt, though he never said it aloud. He laughed it off, joked about it on stage, but those who knew him said that behind the smile was exhaustion not just from touring, but from fighting for a respect that never seemed to last. By 1968, Joe was at his creative height. He released a string of charting singles, blending rhythm and sermon, humor and heartbreak. Buying a Book, Keep the One You Got, and You're Right, Ray Charles showed an artist in full command of his craft. He could turn everyday conversation into poetry, ordinary people into characters, and ordinary pain into something almost holy. Yet Hollywood and the national press rarely mentioned him in the same breath as the stars he had once inspired. In a decade that celebrated boldness and rebellion, Joe Tex represented something quieter: faith, humility, truth. It didn't always fit the image the industry wanted. He began to feel the distance between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. While other performers chased headlines, Joe was searching for meaning. His conversion to Islam had given him peace, but it also isolated him from some of his audience. He refused to perform in venues that served alcohol, cutting into his bookings and profits. The same moral compass that gave his songs integrity was slowly steering him away from the spotlight. Still, he kept recording, his sound evolving with the times. By 1969, he was experimenting with country and soul fusion, releasing Buying a Book, a record that reflected both wisdom and weariness. The cover showed him in quiet confidence, a man who had seen enough of the world to stop pretending. But in the fast-changing landscape of popular music, staying true came at a price. Newer, flashier acts were taking over. Funk was rising, Motown was conquering radio, and Joe Tex, the gentle philosopher of soul, was starting to sound like the voice of another time. He didn't fall, not yet, but somewhere between the applause and the silence after it, he must have felt the shift. The industry that once chased him was beginning to look the other way. And though he didn't know it then, the same depth that made his music timeless would also make him misunderstood in the years ahead. By the early 1970s, Joe Tex had every reason to rest easy. He had carved his name into the story of soul music, a self-made man who had turned rhythm into truth. But fame, like faith, can be fragile. It asks more from you the longer you hold it. After years of relentless touring and recording, Joe began to slow down. The spotlight that once followed him everywhere started to fade. Funk was the new sound. Younger artists, some who had studied his every move, were now taking the stage, reinventing the energy he once owned. The audience still loved him, but the industry's attention had shifted. For a man who had built his career on connecting with people, that silence was devastating. He wasn't built for arrogance or bitterness, yet he carried a quiet sadness, a feeling that maybe he had given his best, and the world had already moved on. In 1970, he tried to adjust. He returned with songs like Give the Baby Anything the Baby Wants and I Gotcha. The latter became a surprise smash, reaching #2 on the Billboard charts and selling more than 2 million copies. Suddenly, Joe Tex was back not as nostalgia, but as proof that the soul he created still had fire left. But even triumph can be heavy when it arrives late. I Gotcha was raw and explosive, full of rhythm and playful tension. It became his biggest hit and his last major one. Joe felt torn between the man he was becoming and the image the industry wanted him to be. He had converted to Islam in 1966, preached peace and modesty, yet here he was singing a song that celebrated lust and power. Fans danced to it, but he struggled to reconcile the message with his faith. Off stage, his world was changing. Friends said Joe was restless, sometimes withdrawn, and often tired. He had lived clean for most of his life, no heavy drinking, no wild scandals, but the road had worn him down. He spent more time at his ranch in Navasota, Texas, raising horses and looking after his family. The music industry, always hungry for the next sensation, rarely called anymore. He had wealth, respect, and memories, but something essential was missing: purpose. Those close to him said he talked often about legacy, what it meant to be remembered, to leave something behind that lasted longer than a song. It was as if he sensed the distance between who he once was and who the world now saw. When Joe Tex looked out over the open Texas fields, he could still hear faint echoes of his old applause. The sound no longer hurt him, it humbled him. He had given everything to his craft, the stage, the sweat, the laughter, the heart. But the silence that followed was louder than he ever imagined. And in that silence, the man who once made the world dance began to wonder if the rhythm had finally left him behind. After I Gotcha, Joe Tex stood at a strange crossroad, successful again, yet more isolated than ever. The applause had returned, but it no longer felt the same. Fame, once a thrill, had become a burden that pressed against his spirit. He withdrew quietly from the spotlight. While others chased the next trend, Joe chose a different rhythm, the rhythm of stillness. He spent long stretches at his ranch in Navasota, Texas, surrounded by the open fields that had once shaped his childhood dreams. There, he found solace in faith, family, and the quiet rituals of daily life. In public, Joe Tex remained a figure of respect. He spoke gently in interviews, more preacher than performer, reminding younger artists that fame was fleeting but purpose was eternal. Yet behind that calm wisdom lay exhaustion. His close friends noticed the change, the slower walk, the longer silences, the moments when his eyes seemed to drift far beyond the conversation. He still recorded occasionally, trying to bridge his old sound with the new era. Albums like Bumps and Bruises and Spill the Beans carried traces of his old humor and insight, but they didn't make the same impact. The music world was shifting toward disco, funk, and the early roots of hip-hop. Joe's storytelling, once revolutionary, was now considered old-fashioned. He accepted it with grace. He had lived enough to know that every voice, no matter how loud, would someday fade. What mattered was how you used it while you had it. But the years took their toll. By 1980, his health was declining. Some said the endless years on the road had drained him. Others believed his heart had simply grown tired. When he reunited briefly with members of the Soul Clan for a revival performance, fans noticed how thin and weary he looked. The smile was still there, but it came slower, softer, like someone remembering, not reliving. In early August 1982, Joe Tex was found unconscious at his home. Doctors revived him, and for a brief moment, it seemed he might recover. But a few days later, on the 13th of August 1982, just 5 days after his 47th birthday, his heart gave out. News of his passing rippled quietly through the music community. There were no grand tributes, no televised specials, just the voices of those who remembered him, fellow musicians, fans, and the few who understood what his music had meant. He left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and 4 sons. But more than that, he left behind an entire language of soul, part sermon, part laughter, part truth. When they laid him to rest under the Texas sky, there were no bright lights or big crowds. Just the sound of the wind, and maybe, somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a man once telling the world to hold what they've got. Long after his passing, Joe Tex's voice never truly disappeared. It lived quietly in the grooves of old vinyl, in jukeboxes forgotten in southern diners, in the laughter and pain of every artist who came after him. You could still hear him in the rhythm of a preacher's cadence, in the storytelling of soul, in the playful wisdom that made his music timeless. Joe Tex had always been different. He didn't shout to be heard, he spoke to be understood. His songs carried the rhythm of conversation, honest, funny, sometimes tender, sometimes tough. That natural storytelling would become the blueprint for generations of singers and even rappers who followed. You can trace his fingerprints through the decades in the funk of James Brown, the swagger of Wilson Pickett, the humor of Rufus Thomas, and even the smooth charisma of later icons like Al Green. For many music historians, Joe Tex stands as the bridge between the gospel roots of the 1950 and the funk revolution of the 1970. He brought something deeply human to soul, not just rhythm, but reflection. Where others sought perfection, Joe offered personality. He turned mistakes into lessons and pain into laughter, reminding listeners that joy and sorrow often come from the same place. His influence also reached far beyond soul. Hip-hop artists later discovered his catalog, sampling his beats and spoken rhythms. Tracks like I Gotcha and Papa Was Too became part of the DNA of modern music. Even without his name in lights, Joe Tex's style, that mix of groove, humor, and truth continued to echo through new generations of sound. But perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't technical at all. It was moral. In a business often ruled by ego, Joe Tex carried humility. He didn't attack his rivals in interviews or chase headlines for attention. He believed the best revenge was to keep creating to let the music outlast the noise. That quiet dignity became part of his myth, an example for artists who wanted to survive fame without losing themselves. In the American South, his legacy grew stronger with time. Radio stations in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia kept his records alive, spinning "Hold What You Got" and "Skinny Legs and All" as if they were new. His songs became family anthems, the kind people played at cookouts, weddings, and long drives down dusty roads. Joe's music reminded everyone that life was messy, funny, and worth singing about. By the late 20th century, critics began to call him what he had always been, the father of Southern soul. They realized that before the legends of funk and R&B found their fame, Joe Tex had already mapped the territory. His humor, heart, and raw honesty had defined a sound that could only have come from America's deep South. And though history once overlooked him, time, as it often does, brought justice in its quiet way. Joe Tex's songs still move people not because they promise perfection, but because they speak truth in the language of the everyday. He may not have worn the crown, but he built the kingdom. Time has a way of softening everything, even the silence that follows a forgotten name. For years after Joe Tex's passing, the world seemed to move on. There were new styles, new stars, and a new rhythm in American music. But every so often, a song would come on the radio, "Hold What You Got," or "The Love You Save," and someone would stop mid-conversation, smile, and say quietly, "That's Joe Tex." It was in those small, human moments that his memory survived. His voice wasn't just a sound from another era. It was a reminder of what music once stood for: sincerity, wit, and heart. Fans who had grown up with his songs passed them down like heirlooms, teaching their children that soul wasn't just about the beat, but about the truth inside the word. By the time critics and historians began re-evaluating his work, Joe Tex had already become something more than a performer. He was a symbol of resilience, of overlooked genius, of the quiet cost of being ahead of your time. Retrospective articles in the 1990s and beyond began calling him the preacher of soul and the storyteller who never needed a script. They saw in him what the industry once missed: a poet of the everyday. Artists who came later often spoke his name with respect. Singers like Al Green and Bobby Womack cited him as a master of natural delivery. Even within hip-hop, his rhythm and phrasing became a hidden foundation. To those who sampled him, Joe Tex wasn't just an old voice, he was an ancestor in sound. In the American South, his story took on a kind of mythic warmth. People who had seen him live still talked about those nights: the laughter, the charm, the way he could make a room of strangers feel like family. They remembered how he'd toss the microphone and catch it mid-air, grin wide, and say something that made you both laugh and think. In towns like Baytown and Navasota, his name carried pride, a reminder that greatness could come from the most ordinary places. Slowly, documentaries and tribute shows began to acknowledge him. Music historians started referring to him alongside the giants: Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, and James Brown. But for those who had loved him all along, that recognition wasn't necessary. They already knew who he was, the man who gave soul its humanity. When people look back on Joe Tex now, they don't just see a singer. They see a teacher, a philosopher, a man who used rhythm to speak truth. His songs still feel alive because they were never about fame. They were about life, the way it hurts, heals, and keeps moving forward. They may have forgotten his name for a time, but not his light. And that's the quiet miracle of legacy. It waits patiently for the world to catch up. The stage is empty now. The microphone stands alone under the soft glow of the lights, and somewhere you can almost hear that voice again, half sermon, half smile. Joe Tex may be gone, but his rhythm never stopped. It lingers in the quiet corners of memory, in every laugh between friends, in every word spoken with truth and warmth. He was never the loudest, never the flashiest. But maybe that's why his music still feels alive. It wasn't built for the moment, it was built to last. He gave us songs that told the truth without preaching, that made us dance while teaching us to forgive. That's a rare gift. and it's one the world didn't fully appreciate until long after the applause had faded. Looking back, Joe Tex's story isn't just about music. It's about resilience, humility, and the courage to stay yourself in a world that keeps asking you to change. He stood tall in his own truth, and because of that, his light still shines, maybe dimmer, maybe quieter, but steady as ever. If you ever find yourself hearing, "Hold what you got," or "Skinny legs and all," take a moment to listen deeper. Beneath the groove, you'll hear the sound of a man who turned life's struggle into joy, who spoke to people the way few ever could with honesty and heart. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Joe Tex the respect he truly deserved? If his story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Because some stars never fade, they just shine where fewer eyes can see. And in the story of soul, Joe Tex will always be the heartbeat that refused to stop.